Thank you. Those were very kind words. I would like to also thank Calvin Sharp for his continued support for a very long time now, and also Michael Scharf and Case Western Reserve's sister and the Cox Center as well. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to all of the guests who are here today. I owe all of you a great personal thanks as well for helping me in my education as I've moved forward to learn about the history of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Great Britain. I would not be able to have done any of the work that I've done without your assistance, so I appreciate that, and I think that everybody in the audience will also benefit greatly from the discussion that you'll be having today. So I'd like to briefly introduce the gentleman who will be speaking, and then I will go through a very, very brief history of the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement for those in the audience who may not be as familiar with the history or the background. And you're not expected at all to have any expertise in that. So first, we have Kevin Downey, who was born and grew up in Derry, Northern Ireland. It's also known as Londonderry. Beginning in 1967, Mr. Downey attended St. Columb's College, a prestigious boys' school that has produced several Nobel Prize winners, including the 1998 Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize co-winner John Hume, the poet Seamus Heaney, and so on. Hume, in fact, strongly encouraged and supported Mr. Downey's work as a member of the Social Democratic and Labor Party, or SDLP, which he joined in 1973, even before graduating from St. Columb's. Mr. Downey obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree in legal science and his master's from Trinity College Dublin in 1979. He worked as a volunteer in general SDLP activities and election campaigns for many years. From 1993 to 1995, he was a member of the SDLP Central Executive. Mr. Downey acted as secretary to Penny Byrne Branch in Derry, as joint election director for the Foyle constituency in the local government elections of 1993. And in the summer of 1978, he actually served as an intern at the offices of U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy and worked on his challenge to President Carter for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1980. Mr. Downey qualified as a solicitor, which here in the U.S. we know as a lawyer, in 1980 and began his legal work the next year. 2 years later, he began his own firm, and to this day, he continues to practice law in Derry. Our second speaker will be Matt Morrison, who was also born and raised in Derry, which is Northern Ireland's second largest urban center. He was raised in a 2-bedroom house with his aunt, grandmother, parents, and 6 younger siblings. As was the case in the rest of Northern Ireland, only one adult per house had the right to vote. The area of Derry, where Mr. Morrison grew up, was also home to others who would become leading figures in the Irish Republican Army, or what we know commonly as the IRA, including Martin McGuinness, as well as several other non-public and top-level leaders of the Army. Like Mr. Downey, Mr. Morrison attended St. Columb's College, and I understand that they knew each other at that time. When he was just 16 years old, Matt Morrison attended a civil rights march with his father. The civil rights march came to be known later as Bloody Sunday, during which 13 unarmed protesters were shot and killed by British paratroopers. After the march, Mr. Morrison decided to join the IRA. As a university student in 1975, he was arrested and sentenced on political charges by a non-jury court, or called a diplock court. He was subjected to interrogation methods, which left him with permanent hearing loss in 1 ear. Despite his young age, while in prison, Mr. Morrison was appointed one of the highest-ranking officers in that purview, and in that capacity, he conducted meetings with British and Irish government officials at their request, as well as with top-level Loyalist paramilitaries. Upon his release in 1985, Mr. Morrison came to the U.S. and married an American citizen. In the mid-1990s, CBS television produced a documentary featuring the legal struggles that he faced living openly in the U.S. as a former IRA member. As the conflict in Northern Ireland raged on, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service categorized him, as well as the roughly dozen and a half other former IRA members living in the United States, as deportable. Mr. Morrison led that group in meetings with Jerry Adams, former IRA leader and president of its political wing, Sinn Féin, during negotiations leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. That agreement conferred a unique political legal status on the former IRA members living in the U.S., one which guarded against their deportation and conferred a host of rights upon them. Since that time, the Patriot Act has complicated that political legal status. Mr. Morrison now lives in St. Louis, Missouri, and he is a nurse and part-time Gaelic teacher. He often speaks on the conflict and peace process in Northern Ireland, on immigrant civil rights issues at universities, including in 2008 at the Department of Political Science here at Case Western Reserve University, and for many nonprofit organizations and interest groups. And then finally, Roy Garland, last but not least, was born and raised in an evangelical home on Belfast's Loyalist Shankill Road. He left school at the age of 14, but spent 2 years in full-time training at the Evangelical Interdenominational All Nations Christian College near London, returning to Belfast when his father died in 1962. There, Mr. Garland began to attend Ian Paisley's Free Presbyterian Church and participated in various protests and rallies in Belfast. He was actively involved in Ulster Unionist Party politics, demanding that Unionist politicians reject Westminster interference in areas legitimately within local jurisdiction. By 1970, however, Mr. Garland began questioning his former views, and in 1973, when he was an undergraduate at Queen's University Belfast reading social science, he completed a certificate in ecumenics through Ulster University and the Irish School of Ecumenics during the mid-1980s. By 1991, Mr. Garland had completed a master's dissertation on the new thinking within the leadership of the modern Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, which was turned into a booklet by the Progressive Unionist Party for distribution among Loyalists and others wishing to understand loyalism. By the mid-1990s, Mr. Garland became involved in the Shankill think tank, discussing a way forward for the Protestant working class. During 1995, he began and continues a weekly Monday column with the Irish News, a nationalist newspaper that is run out of Belfast. That same year, he became a founding member and co-chair of the Cross-Border, Cross-Community Guild of Uriel, based near Dundalk, and promoting dialogue, mutual understanding, and accommodation. Several years later, he had begun work with Sinn Féin leaders on a regular basis with the same view in promoting understanding and accommodation. He again became active in the Ulster Unionist Party, or UUP, by the early 1990s and was the first and virtually only unionist to address the Dublin-based Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. For this, he was disciplined by the UUP, but managed to remain a member. The union group later sought an inclusive agenda, fostering healing and reconciliation within Northern Ireland between North and South, and between Ireland and other parts of the United Kingdom. Mr. Garland organized meetings of the union group with senior Irish and British government ministers. He was part of an organizing committee drawn from the Union Group for East Belfast Speaks Out, believed to be the first such panel discussion organized by Unionists. The panel consisted of Jerry Kelly, a Sinn Féin MLA, Jeffrey Donaldson, a DUP MP, or Member of Parliament and MLA, representative at Stormont Assembly, Patrick Corrigan of Amnesty International, and Lawrence Robertson, MP of the Ulster Conservative and Unionist Shadow Minister for Northern Ireland. And that was chaired by Belfast Lord Mayor Naomi Long, who is an Alliance Party MLA. He is the author of a biography of one of the most famous former Loyalist leaders, if not the most famous former Loyalist leader, Gusty Spence. That book was published in 2001 and has contributed articles to various publications on politics, history, and religion. He is currently working with a project involving IRA veterans of the 1956 to 1962 Operation Harvest Border campaign entitled Then and Now, A Future Without Political Violence. Mr. Garland has worked with former UDA, or Ulster Defense Association, and UVF, Ulster Volunteer Force, prisoners and activists for decades, and is a commentator on radio and television. He is also a regular speaker at meetings involving people from all backgrounds in Ireland, North and South. So those are our speakers for the first panel. And before I turn the panel over to the speakers, I will try to very briefly go through a summary of the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement for those in the audience who may not be as familiar with the history. And in advance, I would like to make a disclaimer that as I'm going through the history and the nature of the agreement very quickly, that it will not be a complete characterization, and therefore I hope that there's no offense given if I omit any important detail. So the Troubles in Northern Ireland lasted roughly 3 decades. Most people date the conflict from roughly 1969 to 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, although there is still sectarian violence continuing in Northern Ireland. I'd like to speak for a moment about the divisions within Northern Irish society. On the one hand, one might characterize a part of society as Unionists and Loyalists, and on the other hand, Nationalists and Republicans. Unionists and Loyalists have a shared broad goal of continued union with the United Kingdom. They come from a Protestant background. Unionists would like to maintain the union with the United Kingdom and any political power through institutional means. And Loyalists, on the other hand, were pro-state paramilitaries, and they used force to maintain union, often with government complicity or support, and there's increasing evidence of this sort of complicity, or what people call collusion. The main armed groups that were associated with Loyalism include the Ulster Defense Association, or UDA, and the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the UVF. And then the mostly Catholic element of Northern Irish society include Nationalists and Republicans, who share the broad goal of fundamental institutional reform and or self-determination, that is, an end to partition and a united Ireland. The Nationalists would like reform or self-determination through nonviolent and institutional means, and Republicans believed that force was necessary to end partition. though they also eventually pursued a parallel electoral strategy. For those who are more familiar with the history of Northern Ireland and the history particularly of the Republican movement, you may be familiar with the phrase, the Armalite and the ballot box, and that was the idea of continuing an armed struggle while also pursuing an electoral strategy. The main armed group associated with the Republican movement was the Provisional Irish Republican Army, or as we commonly know it, the IRA. Very briefly, just to give you an idea of the extent of the human division and destruction during the Troubles, the total number of deaths amounted to over 3,500, which was an average about 2 deaths per week during those 30 years. And injuries in only Northern Ireland, so that excludes the Republic of Ireland, Britain, or Europe, where it was a figure that approached 50,000. Key figures and groups that you may hear the speakers mention today include Tony Blair and John Major, 2 former British Prime Ministers, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, 2 former IRA leaders and now leaders of Sinn Féin, commonly known as the political wing of the IRA, John Hume, who was the leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, or SDLP, the nonviolent Irish Nationalist Party, Ian Paisley, who was head of the Free Presbyterian Church, and the DUP, Democratic Unionist Party, excuse me, and David Trimble, who was co-winner of the 1998 Nobel Peace Prize with John Hume for his work toward the Good Friday Agreement. And then the 2 groups at the bottom are the Garda Síochána and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, better known as the RUC, which were the security forces or police in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, respectively. Just to give a I won't go over each of the events on this timeline, but you can see that the Trouble started off with a civil rights campaign that was largely led by Catholic nationalists. Internment without trial followed shortly thereafter, with Bloody Sunday and the imposition of direct rule in 1972. Moving forward to 1981, there was the second IRA hunger strike, but just generally known as the IRA hunger strike, in which 10 Irish Republican prisoners hunger struck to death, which galvanized the Catholic community around the Republican movement in a way that had not been before. In 1985, there was a watershed agreement known as the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which stipulated the involvement of the Republic of Ireland in any affairs of Northern Ireland for essentially the first time. John Hume and Gerry Adams began secret talks in 1988, and some mark that as the beginning of the peace process. And the peace process continued on. It still continues on, according to many, until this day. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was marred, I think, only by the Omagh bomb, which was a bomb set off by a faction within the Provisional Irish Republican Army that did not look favorably upon the power sharing agreement that the rest of the Provisional IRA signed on to, and 26 civilians were killed during that attack. And this outlines some of the details of the Good Friday Agreement, and I won't go over all of them. But what the Good Friday Agreement stipulated is that there would be a power-sharing Northern Irish executive and that the allocation of any ministries would be proportional to the main parties. Any decisions would also be taken on a cross-community principle. The agreement also stipulated cooperation between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, as well as the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain. The withdrawal of British troops until reaching peacetime levels, which was the end of Operation Banner, which had begun with direct rule in 1972 and was actually the longest military campaign in British history. Importantly, it also stipulated the abolition of the Republic of Ireland's territorial claim to Northern Ireland, which had been enshrined in its constitution. It also stipulated the release of prisoners that were associated with paramilitary groups that were on ceasefire. And as you can see from these figures, there was great support for the Northern Ireland Agreement when there was a referendum held, the Good Friday Agreement, when there was a referendum held on May 22nd. And the turnout was remarkable in the North, and overwhelmingly the citizens voted for continuing union with the United Kingdom. There were some paramilitary groups that did not sign on to the Good Friday Agreement. Although some were initially for the agreement, they subsequently took up violent activities again. Most of these groups are now either moribund or decommissioned. The only two remaining active groups, which may be discussed to a certain extent today, are the Continuity IRA, or CIRA, and the Real IRA, or RIRA. These are known right now as the dissident Republican groups in Northern Ireland, and they are those who are dissatisfied with the Good Friday Agreement. They tend to be dissatisfied with Sinn Féin's performance in government and would like to continue an armed campaign to end partition of the island of Ireland. So without further ado, I will turn the panel over to our distinguished panelists, starting with Mr. Downey.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. And could I preface my remarks firstly by thanking the School of Law here at the University for their kind invitation for me to participate in this event, and I hope they know what they've let themselves in for. I'd just like to clarify one thing, because as you see in the biography, I've been described as a solicitor, and it has come to my knowledge since I've been in the United States that has another meaning over here. It may well be, in fact, that the difference between the two professions is not just quite as much as I would like to hope. However, the most simplistic verdict on the Good Friday Agreement of Easter 1998 is that it is the foundation for a final conclusion to the centuries-old issue of who rules Ireland and how it is to be ruled. It may well prove to be a foundation. However, the central point of my analysis is centred in my belief that it remains at best only that, a foundation, and does not represent a final peace settlement as is popularly publicised in the word media. Great problems and contradictions lie within the agreement. And I would like to look at the topic from five main bases. If I can, I just use this machine. How did we get there? I felt it was important that I could put the whole process in some kind of historical perspective. I know I wasn't aware Bonnie was going to do such a good job ahead of me. However, what I'd like to say is that the euphemistically described troubles which erupted, mainly in 1969, although us in Derry would probably say they commenced in 1968, was the final violent phase of a struggle between the largely native Gaelic Irish population and the British Crown, which from the 1600s on was largely represented by the Unionist Protestant population of the northeastern counties of Ireland. It could be said that the seeds of almost 400 years of conflict were laid during the rule of one Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth I, and the seeds of what will hopefully be the final resolution of that conflict were laid in the reign of another Queen Elizabeth II. The real seeds of the troubles, in my view, were sown in the 1600s when the British Protestant Queen Elizabeth I finally vanquished the native Catholic Gaelic chieftains in the struggle for control of the island. The most difficult and obstinate of them controlled the province of Ulster to the north, and to ensure that they never rose again, their lands were confiscated and awarded as spoils of war to loyal and dependable British subjects of the British Crown. They in turn planted them with thousands of Protestant, Scottish and Northern English settlers, whose main task was firstly to earn a good living for themselves off the land if they could, secondly to provide a stable rental income for the newly awarded holders of the land, and thirdly to act as a militia and a yeomanry to help suppress any further native uprisings. And so began 400 years of resentment, suspicion, hatred, and sometimes outright rebellion and war between Gael and Planter, which was culminated ultimately in the Botch Settlement, which was the Treaty of 1922. The treaty avoided grasping the nettle of how the two communities could share the island, and the British Protestant population could be persuaded to relinquish power in the north. It accepted partition of the island and permitted the Protestant heartland of the north to govern its own territory. In my view, the treaty ducked a final solution by permitting the 6 northeastern counties of the island, comprising 2/3 of the province of Ulster, to have self-government separate from the remainder of the island. The remainder of the island following a path of quasi-independence within the British Empire under nationalist republican control, and final independence as a republic free of the Crown in 1949. And so the island settled down to a form of peace in which most of the island was governed by the mostly Catholic Gaelic population, and the remainder 6-county area was governed by an artificially created Protestant Unionist majority, led by a Unionist elite which was loyal to Britain, with only one fly in the ointment, which was people like us, people like myself, and people like Matt. The Catholic population that found itself trapped within the borders of the new Northern Ireland state, in our view abandoned by the rest of the island and dominated by a new Protestant majority. Trapped within the Northern Ireland state, making up approximately 1/3 of its population, was this population, mainly Catholic, 1/3 of the population, too many to be removed. So they were controlled by a system of government which ensured that they were permanently dominated and kept from the levers of power. And this situation pertained largely until the advent of free education for all, brought in Britain by a Labour government, which was also applied to Northern Ireland. And this over the late 40s and the 1950s and into the early 1960s resulted in the development of an educated Catholic middle class who in the 1960s watched the civil rights struggle here in the United States, and then who looked at places like my hometown in Derry, with its chronic unemployment among Catholics, with its poor housing, and with the governing local council gerrymandered by the Unionist minority in the city to ensure that they still ruled it despite their minority status. And the local Catholic population finally asked why, and then they concluded and decided enough. So the population took to the streets in 1968, demanding reform and equality, and the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was born. Now, at face value, it seems impossible to resist the logic of its demands. But in my view, the problem for the ruling Unionist elite and their dilemma was that granting equality would undermine the foundation stones of their control of Northern Ireland, which was that their control of the ordinary working class Protestant population, from whom people like Roy Garland sprang, depended upon ensuring their continued support through one, demonising the Catholic community as disloyal, untrustworthy and lesser beings than themselves, and out to destroy them and their religion if we get the chance. And secondly, by favouring them in jobs and housing, although I think we probably came to the conclusion that they weren't just as favoured as we would have thought, looking at it from our standpoint. The problem for the elite was that if full equality was ceded to the Catholic community, the Protestant majority would ask questions of the rulers, which they could not answer. And this combined with fear, which had been inculcated into them over the 50 years of the Northern Ireland state by their elite masters, escalated to a level which the Unionist government finally could no longer control. And so against the backdrop of violence and suppression, the Troubles commenced. And with them, the age-old issue of why things were so, and thus the re-emergence of the IRA to try and finish what had been avoided in 1922, the final removal of British rule in Ireland. What was it like growing up in Derry in those days? Well, it's sometimes hard to categorise, I think. I was 12, 13 years of age in 1968, 69. I was reared throughout those years in a largely Catholic area, in fact, an almost completely Catholic area, which adjoined Craigan Estate on the one side and the Bogside on the other, which became the two heartlands of the provisionals in Derry. And partly in a city centre street where my father had a menswear shop, and we lived above the shop for a period of time. And the street had its back to the famous and historic Derry walls, and its face down towards the Bogside. I would regard my childhood as a happy childhood. When you're growing up and just getting on with life, you're not aware of discrimination or deprivation. And as I say, our area was almost exclusively Catholic, and so the Protestant population did not really impinge on our lives to any extent as children. Now, the start of the Troubles really occurred as I was entering my teens. But I have to say my memories, perversely, were probably quite good at the start. Because in those early days, we didn't really know very much about the whole political or historical background. All we knew was that what was happening in the streets was fun. And it was exciting. It was real life cowboys and Indians, or war games to us, with the difference that it quite often had the imprimatur of the adults. And also it was covered with the TV cameras. And we would quite often participate on events in the street and then rush home to see if we could see ourselves on television. So in some ways the early rioting years were probably quite recreational and pure adrenaline at our young age. However, for Derry particularly and for the whole country, all that changed utterly in January of 1972 with Bloody Sunday. Suddenly people were dying, and I started taking an interest in what was happening, reading newspapers, studying history, following political debates. Provisional IRA was partly born at this time, largely out of a sense of anger and outrage, firstly at the internment raids of 1971, but particularly as a result of the events in the streets of Derry in January 1972. The main political representatives of the civil rights movement had formed a political party called the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, which advocated Irish unity, but peacefully and with the consent of the majority of people. It advocated equal, peaceful coexistence between the communities, power shared between them. It, in essence, advocated the core principle of what became the Good Friday Agreement. And the short-lived Sunningdale settlement of 1974, which tried to encapsulate those principles, collapsed within a few months in the teeth of an all-out Loyalist general strike. Now, at this stage, I was becoming quite politically aware. So, as you've heard, Matt joined the IRA. Why did I not join it? I would always advocate that was probably down to 10% principle and 90% cowardice. More out of fear of my father finding out than any fear of the police or the army. I would probably have to concede, if I can also take the fifth on it as well, that I did participate in some low-level rioting activities back in the early days, and I learned how to make petrol bombs. But as I progressed to the later stages of what you would call a high school education here in the States, and particularly studied history and literature, I concluded that armed rebellion was doomed to failure, that rational political persuasion offered the only way forward, and so I joined the SDLP. Now, some of my generation, like Matt, reached a different conclusion and took a different path. But unlike many older members of the SDLP, I had an instinctive understanding with many of my contemporaries who joined the IRA, because I knew a lot of them, and I knew why they had joined, and I knew that they held their views sincerely, even if I disagreed with them. Because I also had witnessed what they had witnessed and felt the same rage. I encountered them often on the streets during the many election campaigns that took place in the next 20 years. And sometimes those jousts could become almost akin to sport. But as the 1980s progressed, I got married and I started a business career. And the troubles settled down, if this doesn't sound perverse, they settled down to being frequently, not sometimes only background noise. They settled down to become a way of life. They were a bit like a dull ache in a tooth. At times you were acutely aware of the pain, and at other times you almost ceased to even notice it as you get on with your own normal business of living, loving, making a few dollars to support a family and pay a mortgage. To a great extent, the abnormal for us became the normal. And so the decades passed, and 25 years of low-intensity war with occasional savage highlights from the mid-1970s to the build-up through the mid-1990s to what became the Good Friday Agreement. I worked as a political activist for the SDLP. I tramped the streets, distributed literature, I helped collect funds, and I participated in election campaigns. And for a period of that time, as Bonnie said, I worked in a more structured position as an election director and as a member of the party's central executive. But I have to say I was never really tempted to political representation. I preferred working in the background and contributing to events, and letting other people take the credit if they were successful and having to take the brickbats if they weren't. Because to a certain extent I would have considered power without responsibility. So how did we get here to the Good Friday Agreement itself? Well, I want to say something about it. The basic framework of the agreement represented the culmination of efforts of nationalist groups, and in particular I would say, and I suppose I would, the SDLP, to move the island towards a settlement which recognised the legitimacy of the aspirations of both communities in the north, which permitted both communities to continue to pursue their aspirations either towards continued union with Great Britain or towards the development of an all-Ireland state with no direct political governance from Britain. And in the meantime, set up an administration in Northern Ireland based on the sharing of power between the two communities for an indefinite period, which removed coercion by one community upon the other to accept their view and took the gun out of Irish politics, which set up structures to govern relationships between North and South, as well as within the 6 counties, and between Britain and Ireland. And finally, which sought the endorsement and mandate for this approach from all the people of Ireland. The circumstances had arisen on all sides, or were engineered, particularly through the efforts of the Anglo-Irish Secretariat set up under the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which Bonnie mentioned, which laid the groundwork for an agreement becoming possible. The official Unionist Party, reluctantly in my view, were persuaded, and later the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, acquiesced to the acceptance of power sharing as a principle. Because the Unionists wanted the return of self-government and local control of political power. But their insistence on the principle of majority rule, which they clung to right through the Troubles, had proved a futile policy which they recognised the British would never ever permit again because of how they'd run Northern Ireland in the 50 years that the state existed. Sinn Féin and the IRA, they were eventually persuaded to pursue their goals by peaceful and non-violent means and to accept constitutional change on the basis of persuasion of the majority of the community. How did they come to that? Well, my view is they'd fought a war for 25 years, which the leadership eventually recognised that they could not win and could no longer sustain indefinitely. Some kind of way out of conflict had to be found, a kind of peace with honour. They had recognised from the time of the hunger strikes at the start of the 1980s that Sinn Féin had a political support which could be more usefully employed than indefinite war. The British, for their part, well, they realised that they couldn't defeat the IRA either, although they could sustain indefinitely. However, the conflict was destabilising in Britain at times, and it was frequently an embarrassment abroad, and particularly right here in the United States. Also, and very important to the whole process, was the influence of a very powerful Irish-American political force led by Ted Kennedy and by Tip O'Neill and by others. And most importantly, by the presence of a powerful power broker in the White House, President Clinton, who won the trust of all sides and used the power and aura of the Oval Office to bring pressure to bear on the British to enter meaningful discussions with Sinn Féin and the IRA, and also held out the benefits of US investment in a peaceful Ireland. Also in 1997, Britain gained a Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who was probably the most genuinely committed British Prime Minister since Gladstone at the end of the 19th century, to seeking a resolution of what the British always called their Irish question. Martin Luther King's quote, "There are moments when the politically expedient becomes the morally wise," became accepted on all sides, and so the stage was set for the signing of the most historic agreement ever signed in Ireland, one signed by the British, the Irish, and both communities. And it arrived in a wave of euphoria, enthusiasm, and relief. So where are we today? Well, I regard the settlement, or the agreement, as a welcome first step, but at the moment, little more than that. The initial euphoria has faded. It's not a final settlement. It is a transitional feel. It's unwieldy. It's in some ways unnatural, and it's not a particularly stable construct. In my view, it's not peace, but an absence of war. Although in Derry in the last few weeks, we don't even have that, as the dissident Republicans have exploded 2 car bombs within the last couple of months. There's still dissent, and there's disillusionment among ordinary people with politicians generally, which is maybe a global phenomenon, but it's certainly present. An analysis of the current executive shows me that the nature of power rarely changes. Neither community can point to any real benefits from the agreement. An entrenched upper echelon of mainly unionists, but not exclusively, businessmen and public servants, in my view, still continue to control and to hold the purse strings of power. Hapless politicians, both unionist and nationalist, but particularly nationalist, in my view, are effectively being led by the nose by what I would call these masters of control. The naysayers of unionism have settled sullenly, but reasonably contentedly, into the seat of governance. And Sinn Féin, in my view, and no doubt Matt will not be able to wait to get up to argue with me, has effectively settled for a SDLP/Irish government agenda, and they finally got their hands on the levers of power in Northern Ireland, but only to discover the levers of power are no longer connected to the engine, because real power still rests at Westminster, and Northern Ireland gets its pocket money in the form of its grant, and it has to spend it well. Aside from a well-heeled middle class, this lack of any real economic benefit for either community, in my view, remains the principal weakness of the agreement. It has done little to distribute wealth in a fair and even-handed manner, and it has done little to integrate the two communities. To my view, sectarianism remains rife, and possibly in some ways even worse than ever. Epitomised, in my view, by the leader of the Official Unionist Party, Mr. Elliott, not being able, even in this day and age, to bring himself to attend a GA match, and to be leading the opposition to the building of a new motorway, which will eventually link Derry to Dublin. And in the nationalist community, there's still no sense that United Ireland is any closer. So the lessons, which is in some way what this symposium is all about, well, if you can distill any principles out of our experience, I think we can summarise them in what I would call in 7 main points. Number 1, both sides, I think, have to fight to a realisation that they cannot win outright. Both sides must have a leadership at that time that can control its rank and file, and which can take political risks and have the courage to be unpopular. The agreement also set down what I consider a very important principle, which is the preconditions and the forcing of one side or the other into commitments in advance should be avoided at all costs. And I hope that Senator Mitchell is telling that to the Israelis in their views of Hamas at the moment. The agreement established a principle that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And in my view, that provided a flexibility for compromise, because as the complex negotiations unfolded, it avoided a perception on either side that one side was winning more than the other. The other vitally important issue was that the ordinary people's consent simply has to be obtained. It's no good for the parties to reach an agreement. And one of the benefits of the Good Friday Agreement was that it put the whole agreement to a referendum, which gave it a legitimacy. Then, as I've already touched on, the ordinary people must feel that they're benefiting from the agreement. A financial investment, in my view, in any settlement is absolutely essential. Because at the end of the day, most disputes are all about money and they're all about power. And 7, I think, which is maybe a more sort of a psychological or philosophical view, all sides, in my view, have to be ready for that sense of deflation that inevitably will set in after the initial wave of euphoria and bombast has passed. Because no settlement is ever perfect. It will always require support and encouragement. It must always be backed up by an economic process that benefits ordinary people and not an elite few. It has to be fair, but more importantly, it has to be seen to be fair. Every side must be prepared to be disappointed that they did not get a lot of what they wanted. They must be prepared to look at the other guy's face and see it looking pretty sullen and dissatisfied, and take comfort from that in some ways, and take some satisfaction from what they themselves have gained on their side. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, in our peace process, I feel that the 6th of those conditions is still not adequately present, and the 7th one, I think, may not be properly balanced as yet between the two northern communities. The British and Irish governments, in my view, are happy because they can now relegate us to the back of their minds and get on with the larger problems that confront them. The reality of our settlement, in some ways, this is maybe coming now home to a realisation for the likes of me, and hopefully for people like Matt and his associates, is that the people that we want to unite with in the South, by and large, I think, don't really care less if they ever saw us again. And the people with whom we remain tied and ruled by would probably be happily rid of us at this stage if they thought that they could, now that the strategic value of Ireland in this new globalised world has ended. So, to sum up, if this agreement has not yet achieved real peace, real and lasting peace, it at least has brought about a relative absence of war. And I would, to use that great legal phrase, respectfully submit that that is a good start. Thank you. Is that my neat vodka?
This photograph is not put up to scare you, but actually will become pertinent at the end of my presentation. So you can bear looking at it. I'll come back to it later. My name is Matt Morrison. Like Kevin, I'm from Derry. So this whole discussion is heavily weighted towards the western portion of the 6 counties.
The real capital.
And actually, I'll make the point as I go along here that Kevin and I have a lot of convergence in our viewpoints, and there's a few points of divergence that mainly revolve around the fact that there is a continuum that exists between Irish nationalism and Irish militant republicanism. But I'll touch on that later on. Let me begin here by thanking Case Western for inviting us here, because I really am committed to the idea and to the grandiose notion that discourse at a whole variety of levels promotes understanding, and that understanding promotes solutions, not just for the north of Ireland, but for maybe perhaps provides template for areas of conflict elsewhere in the world. I'm very unsophisticated here. I'm a fingers in the dirt sort of a guy, and I think that will be the hallmark of my presentation here. Let me begin by thanking Case Western for bringing us here, and particularly Michael Sharf, Bonnie Weir, Calvin Sharp, Robert Rawson. And of course, I have to acknowledge the real power behind the throne, Nancy Pratt, who did so much organizing in and around this issue here, and it would be a travesty not to acknowledge that. Thank you, Nancy. I think I just scored a few brownie points with Nancy Pratt. If I told you I was an impartial observer, you wouldn't believe me. Okay, so let me state it clearly. I am not an impartial observer, but I think what I bring to this discourse is another form of prism, another lens through which you might consider the conflict in the north of Ireland. And how I intend to do this is actually make a suggestion that very often academics have a tendency to try to explain, or they cling to the idea that everything is explicable through statistical analysis. And clearly that is not the case. And in Ireland in particular, the politics of the personal are extremely important in either making things happen or in creating a variety of obstructions along the way. One of the points I want to make before I actually start here is that I said to Calvin Sharp yesterday evening that I think in a way it's kind of brave, and actually it upholds the greatest academic standards. The Case Western is actually sponsoring this discourse today, because in post 9/11 USA, there kind of is a fearful atmosphere, and that type of atmosphere has a tendency to mute discourse, dampen discourse, obstruct discourse, and that really is sad in a whole variety of ways. So again, I thank Calvin Sharp, I thank this program, I thank Case Western for encouraging this discourse. My late father-in-law, Jim Broderick, was a Marine forward observer in World War II in the Pacific Theater. He was in Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and to put it mildly, he saw a lot of death and destruction, saw a lot of ugliness. So about a couple of months before he died, a few years ago, it kind of startled me in conversation. He said, in my opinion, he said, the conflict in the north of Ireland actually was a much more difficult conflict. And I was puzzled because by scale, the conflict was infinitesimally small compared to the grand slaughter that occurred in the Pacific Theater of War. And he said, because it was up close and personal. It occurred between neighbors, between friends, and in a way that made it a lot more difficult. And it made the conflict actually in many ways a lot more bitter. And I think Roy and I have had conversations about this, and I think you'll agree with that. So if there's one thematic issue that I want to leave you with, it's a note to academics, never to underestimate the politics of the personal, particularly when you're considering the conflict in Ireland. I want to talk about my own personal history, and that's the prism through which I look at things. So, and that's what I'm here for today, to offer that to you. When I say defensively, I don't want to talk about me in some narcissistic manner, but rather to make the point that my experience actually was not atypical. It was very, very typical. So if you give me a few minutes, I'll talk about my own personal history and maybe give you some insight and some understanding as to how I became involved in IRA and the why of it. I was born in Derry in 1955 to Paddy and May Morrison, who were poor Catholics who lived in the Brandywell. Out of economic necessity, I lived in an extended family environment in a tiny house at the foot of Bishop Street in the Brandywell area. The Brandywell subsequently came to be known to the world press as part of the Bogside Catholic Nationalist Republican ghetto. We were poor as church mice, and because everybody else in our community was in the same state for the most part, we didn't recognize that we were living in poverty. But what we did know was that we were living in oppression, because it was communicated to us on a daily basis. We were living at the fringe of society. We were unwanted in our own society. And how that was transmitted to us was by dint of the fact that there was not universal suffrage. By dint of the fact that as I grew up, my father had to travel abroad for work because as a Roman Catholic, he could not get a job in his own city. In fact, I remember him bringing home rejection slips, and there would be 2 letters on the rejection slip, RC, Roman Catholic, because employers were bound to explain why they didn't hire someone. And it was done unashamedly. It was done unabashedly. In the 60s, young educated Catholics began to come into university city, or out of the university system, in large numbers, probably for the first time. And they were very, as I've said in multiple cases before, they were very disinclined to accept the role of second-class citizen. And what they did was they looked around for a template, for a model in which they could create a campaign for equality. And actually where they looked was across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States of America, and they looked to the campaign of Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights reformers here in the United States of America. We stole the general theme, and in the small detail, we even stole your songs, okay? And it was only subsequently, as I got a bit older, I realized that we were guilty of grand larceny. But the point of the matter is, the idea was good, and we were working towards something that our parents hadn't worked too hard at. We were not going to be passive. We were going to go on the streets, and we were going to demand our civil rights. Unfortunately, the unionist regime in Stormont responded in a very heavy-handed manner. And rather naively, and I'll make this point, we failed to understand one very essential point. And what we failed to understand was, and Kevin touched on this earlier, was that a regime that was founded and operated on discrimination and depended on discrimination for survival and to perpetuate its own existence was really incapable of reform. Got that? We failed to miss that major point. And in that regard, we were collectively naive. Of course, we kept marching, and of course, we kept getting beat off the streets. And we didn't really learn our lesson maybe the way we should have. And then came along Bloody Sunday, January 30th, 1972. When, as Bonnie pointed out, as a 16-year-old, I attended a civil rights march. And British Army paratroopers murdered us in large numbers on the streets of Derry. And the British government came behind and sanctioned that murder with the Woodgery Tribunal, and they collectively rubbed salt on our wound. And the message that they sent out to us in a very clear manner was that you're not valued, you're not wanted, you're in the periphery of society, and we are going to keep you there, and don't dare think that you're going to have equality. Now, this is where I diverged from Kevin and the SDLP. It was at that point I decided that the only way that we were going to get equality was by dismantling what I perceived as the British colonial apparatus in the north of Ireland. And the only way I could see that happening at that point was to join the IRA, to take up arms. Now remember, prior to 1969, the IRA was virtually a moribund organization and it didn't exist. But when we were attacked by Loyalist mobs, B-Men, RUC, we had no way of defending ourselves. We were throwing stones and throwing Molotov cocktails at forces that were heavily armed, if not particularly well armed. So there was a very fundamental and very basic rationale. A, defense, and B, that somehow or other we would be able to force the British colonial apparatus to fold up its tents and head back to London. As a consequence of my involvement with the IRA, I wound up actually spending 10 years in a British prison. And you may be interested to know that the last time I saw this man was when he came to visit me in Long Cash in 1978. I haven't seen him since then. So on a personal note, I just got to tell you how wonderful it is to be here in Cleveland and to actually make Kevin's acquaintance again. And the point I'm going to make again is, this is another illustration of the politics of the personal. Philosophically, I was at odds with this man. Politically, I was at odds with this man, but the bottom line is, the politics of the personal kicked in, and he came to see me as his friend. And that's stuff that has been lost and missed in its entirety along the way by people who have come to review, analyze, and come up with some explanation for the conflict. So I was in Long Cash, in the cages of Long Cash as a political prisoner with special category status when the hunger strike occurred. And I lost a particularly good friend of mine, a man that I grew up with, who actually briefly attended St. Columns as well, Patsy O'Hara. I was not a member of the Provision IRA. He actually was associated with the Irish National Liberation Army. And to put it mildly, the effect of the hunger strike was, I can't even put words on it on a personal level, but on a political level, what it did was it internationalized the struggle again in the north of Ireland and actually provided the opportunity for an alternative vehicle for the Republican movement in the north of Ireland to make its voice heard. Bobby Sands, prior to his death and hunger strike, was elected to the British Parliament as a member for South Tyrone and Fermanagh. And the message that came out of that was clear and simple. It was that what the British propagandists had been saying all along, that the IRA were a bunch of mindless terrorists and psychopaths, that they had no base of support in the community, was shown for the lie that it actually was. Now, again, I want to remind you, how am I for time, Bunny? What the heck? I'll ignore the yellow card when it's held up. But what it did was, it exposed that for the lie it is. And actually, again, what it does is, it shows up the politics of the personal. And I'll state this real simply. There was a lot of people who normally would vote for the SDLP who were so aroused and angry at how the British had pursued an obstructionist policy with regards to achieving resolution of the conflict within the prisons, that it resulted through a whole series of barbarities in the second hunger strike, the blanket protest, the dirty protest, all horrible things that occurred there, that we had a situation where people who might have otherwise voted Social Democratic and Labour Party actually offered their support to the prisoners by giving their vote to Bobby Sands, who was entombed in an H-block cell at that particular point in time. Margaret Thatcher stonewalled on the issue, and the 10 men died in hunger strike, tragically. And dare I say it, they died in many ways unnecessarily. So, getting back to narcissistic me again here, I was released from Long Cash in 1985. Prior to my release as a senior prisoner in the cages, I had the opportunity I'm very glad for, to have discourse with leaders of Loyalist paramilitary groups. Actually, one of the connections between Roy and I is that I met a friend of his, Billy Mitchell, and had multiple conversations with him. And on a personal level and on a political level, I came to understand in a very real sense that Billy Mitchell was not only a smart guy, not only someone that was had given a lot of thought to the nature of the conflict, and was very articulate on behalf of his own people in the Loyalist community, but actually was anxious and was eager to get the grips with the Republican movement and various other entities to achieve some sort of a solution. I believe that one of the main blocks to what subsequently became the Good Friday Agreement, or Good Friday Accord, was the fact that the British were playing a double game. And I guess you could say the IRA and the Republican movement, to a certain extent, was playing a double game. You know, Bonnie referred to the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other. Well, the British played a similar game. They were still portraying the Republican movement as a bunch of terrorists. And the problem is, and this is something as academics you want to consider, if you brand someone a terrorist, you've got to be aware that there is a consequence of that. And the consequence is that you shut down discourse. And not only do you shut down discourse, you actually, in many ways, you ignore what are often valid issues that individual or group may bring to the table for consideration. So that's a reality. And discourse is like, speaking now as a nurse, I'm a very profound nurse. You are either pregnant or you're not pregnant, okay? You can't be half pregnant. Well, the thing about discourse is either you're having discourse or you're not. You're in the business for moving towards peace or you're not. And similarly, with the Unionist regime in the north of Ireland, a regime is either repressive or it's transparently democratic. And I say the Unionist regime, which denied us our rights in the north of Ireland, was repressive. And similarly, a regime like the white apartheid regime in South Africa was similarly oppressive. And the solution could not be a half repressive regime or a less repressive regime. The solution has to be a transparent and democratic society. And it makes me pause briefly and remind you that in post 9/11 United States of America, it's really critical that you remember that. Because I think the most precious thing that you have is your Constitution. And if you compromise your Constitution in the so-called fight against terrorism, the main victims are going to be the citizenry of the United States of America and not the so-called terrorists that you're pursuing. But that's a brief aside. So let me just make a few points by way of wrapping up my presentation. One, Good Friday Agreement actually is a gateway. And anybody that looks at it realizes that. And it makes the point that in many ways, Maintaining the peace dissipates as much energy of a different type maybe a more positive, more constructive energy than conflict. But the problem with the peace is that things become grayer, the battle lines become blurry, and things can get really difficult. And political infighting can become more and more bitter. And when I infighting, I mean infighting on one side or the other. That's the first thing. On a personal note, the Good Friday Agreement yielded a very positive benefit for me personally, in that I was fighting deportation. And at the instruction of President Clinton and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, my deportation and the deportation of several other former Irish prisoners here in the United States was put on hold. Had it not been for that, I would have been doing this presentation by Skype from Derry rather than standing in front of you. One of the points I'm going to make is whether you agree or disagree with IRA, it's really irrelevant. The point I would make is that had the IRA not pushed the envelope, and here's a point for your consideration, had the IRA not pushed the envelope militarily, had Sinn Féin not pushed the envelope politically, the question has to be asked, would the British have come to the table? Would the Unionists have given any meaningful consideration to the idea of effecting any form of resolution? And I ask that as a question, and try to give that some thought when you get a chance. The other thing I'm going to say is this, and Calvin Sharp probably knows better than anybody else right now what I mean by this. When you render someone voiceless, you are going to frustrate them. When you marginalize them, you deny them hope. So whatever we do, whether it's discourse or whether it is establishing a political system, it's got to be all-inclusive. You cannot cherry-pick who comes to the table. When you do that, you're actually laying the groundwork for future disaster. So let me say that again. You cannot cherry-pick who comes to the table. Everybody should be able to draw up a chair and should be able to speak frankly and honestly to represent their position and the position of their people. One thing, how much, I've got 1 minute, oh my God. Okay, I'll just say this. One of the untold stories is the role of the Irish government. That's maybe a subject for another symposium elsewhere at a different time in a different place. I'm going to make the point that I really believe from the bottom of my heart that probably the most manipulated group, ironically, in the north of Ireland has been the working class unionist people. Kevin, you touched on that, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. And I know Roy and I have talked about that prior to this presentation this morning. So, to wrap up, now I've got about 15 seconds left. I hope you don't have a sniper in the back of the hall who's going to shoot me if I go over here. This photograph, as you can see, was taken about 1962 in our local church, the Long Tower Church. And that is a photograph of our altar boy team. And the goofy looking dude with the specs, that's actually me, believe it or not. And I asked Bonnie to put that photograph up because in many ways, it's a metaphor in and of itself. And actually, it supports a very fundamental question. And here's the question. Oh, and by the way, I'll make the point. Who is missing from that photograph is Raymond McCartney, who's now an elected member of Parliament, and who actually was on the first hunger strike in Longcash. He was a member of my altar boy team also. The question I want to ask is this. What set of circumstances resulted in 4 of the guys in that photograph winding up as members of the provisional IRA and going to prison or being shot or whatever? And I don't ask that question lightly. I don't ask it, tongue-in-cheek or jokingly. What set of circumstances resulted in that? And I suggest to you that the answer is the exclusion total in its form of our people from the political and economic life of the north of Ireland. So on that note, let me wrap up, or Bonnie Weir will get really angry. And thank you, each and every one of you, for coming here this morning and for giving me your ear. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me this morning. It's a real privilege to be here. And thank the university. I mean, we've been so well treated. It's been a wonderful experience already. And it's also, I suppose, for a unionist, an opportunity that I think hasn't been all that available in the past. Probably more because of unionists than anyone else, because unionists were actually, for a time, reluctant to go either to the south of Ireland or go to America. Now some did, but there was a certain reluctance, and I think there was a feeling that nobody understands us. And there was also a feeling that there was sort of a plot to undermine us and all that type of thing. I'm also, by the way, going to talk more in Matt's sort of approach from a personal point of view, because that's what I know, not just a personal point of view, but what my own experience is. And it has been a long road. The emphasis on the long road is because for me, the troubles began, or the impetus to the troubles began much earlier than '69, which I'll try to illustrate. First of all, I was born and reared on the Shankill Road, which is, actually, as I was growing up, it was seen as the heart of the empire, believe it or not, this road. And Gusty Spence actually, he's good at drawing illustrations of what it means for people. And he drew an illustration. He said a young fella a wee boy, he hadn't got a seat in his trousers, he was in poverty, and he's looking at a map of the world, and there's a whole lot of red bits on it, you know, Australia, Canada, India, you know, all these parts of the British Empire. And he said to his mate, we own all that. You know, he'd nothing, but we own the empire, and in a sense identifying with that empire. And coming from the Shankill was a great pride. Actually, there was a mixture of pride and almost shame, because the Shankill Road had a bad reputation, always had a reputation of a place where people fought and where there was trouble and so on. But actually I grew up there and never had any problem at all. I mean, it was one of those things. There was fighting, but it was sort of like controlled fighting. On that road, I was born up at the top of the road. The roads on the left go straight to the Falls Road, and as I was growing up, you could go to the Falls Road. There was no peace line, there was no barriers. But when I went down there, we knew that we were in enemy territory. I'm talking about going right back to certainly the early 50s, maybe even the 40s. And we would go to the Falls Road to go to the swimming baths, because they had better swimming baths than we had. Swimming baths were down at the bottom of the road in Peters Hill, and they weren't very good, so we went to the Falls Road. But when we went there, if you had, as Gusty Spence would have had a picture of the Union Jack or something, some Loyalist slogans on his arm, he would cover it with a plaster so that nobody could see it. But the Catholics always wore their, in those days, their St. Christophers. So you knew who was a Catholic and who was not a Catholic. And you were always afraid of being asked the question, what are you? Which meant, are you a Protestant or Catholic? And if you said the wrong thing, you were in trouble. Now that happened in both areas. But I lived in that community. It was a Protestant community. And even if you did talk to anyone outside that community, you never talked about the things that divided you. So you didn't really understand. You weren't taught Irish history. You knew nothing about the background. You knew nothing about what the IRA represented. And I've done a lot of thinking about how I got to where I got to and came through all this. And it was a long and difficult journey. One of the things in my home on the Shankill Road was this picture. It's a picture of Dan Winter's cottage where the Orange Order was founded in 1795, but the picture I think is 1895. My father pointed to the picture and said, one of your ancestors is one of those men. He was a founder member of the Orange Order. And it was years later that I looked closely at this, and there's a man, the man on the left has got a gun, the man on the right just past the door's got a gun, and the other man here's got a gun, and there's a man on the horse that you can hardly see has got guns. So it was, and there was always that defensive mentality within the Unionist community that somehow we're under threat. But that, I didn't know anything about the Orange Order, but it obviously encouraged a certain fascination. But Derry, our two friends here are both from Derry. Derry always played a big part in my background and understanding because the stories of the relief of Derry. This is an orange banner depicting the Protestants behind the walls living on rats and cats and mice and dogs, which you actually paid for, a matter of pence for a mouse, a few shillings for a dog to eat when they were starving. And that was sort of like, I suppose for the Unionist community, that was like equivalent to the Irish famine. That was our struggle, and it was an iconic thing that I grew up with. And the siege mentality that I'm sure you've heard about is something which was part of us and is still part of us. And if you don't understand the siege mentality, you can't understand Unionists. But I was this. I'm trying to convey to you where I came from and what it meant, and that would be typical of not all Protestants, but most of them. I had a children's Bible, quite a big thing, about this thick, a large Bible, and in that Bible, which I pored over as a young child, there was these pictures, and these are two of the pictures, and there are others that I identified with. And it's all about suffering and about persecution. On the left-hand side is Daniel in the lion's den because he refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. On the right-hand side is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you know who those people are, you've read your Bible. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in a similar position, and they were put into the burning fiery furnace and suffered there. And as people looked on, there was another figure there which is believed to have been Christ. But it's the idea of suffering for your faith. And I grew up with a very strong identity with Daniel and with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we were also told, we were always told selective history. And we were told about the persecution of the Protestant by the Catholic Church. Those like Latimer and Ridley, who died at the stake in England. When I was in Oxford, I remember seeing the spot. It was in Oxford, I think they were actually burned at the stake. And I saw a cross in the road with the spot where they were actually burned to death. And there was a great feeling of sort of identity with those people that was part of me. But the thing was, what it meant to me was that I was absolutely determined to stand for what I saw as the faith and the truth, come what may. And my father had become an evangelical Christian. Actually, he was a member of a church which is based in Anderson, Indiana, but had a branch in Belfast, which I'll mention again later. I was brought up in an evangelical world. This church here, which I went to as a child, that's my two children on it, but I went there as a child, and lots of other mission halls. It was built by Amy Carmichael. Anybody heard of the word Amy Carmichael? No? Amy Carmichael was an evangelical Christian who built this church for the mill workers. My mother was a mill worker. My father, by the way, left school when he was 12. This sounds incredible. I still find it incredible. My mother when she was 13, but she was already working in the mills part-time from she was about 10. And she was working in the mill from something like 6 o'clock in the morning to 6:30 at night, with just short breaks for breakfast and so on. But Amy Carmichael built this for the mill workers who didn't have the clothes, because if you went to church in those days on the Sunday, you had to be dressed up in good clothes. So if you didn't have the good clothes, you went somewhere else where you could go in your duds sort of thing. But I was brought up and absolutely immersed in that world. But it was in 1955, but there's an awful lot of American connections in my life as well. Jack Shuler was a preacher from America. I think he died when he was only about 49, quite young. He had a crusade in Belfast, and I decided, he said, if you're not sure you're a Christian, you're probably not a Christian, and I wanted to be a Christian. And I asked my mother, what does it mean to be saved? And she says, it means you don't go to hell, you go to heaven. And from what I'd heard about hell, it didn't sound very nice, so I wanted to go to heaven. So, but I wasn't sure whether I was saved or not. So Jack Shuler preaching, and I decided, he actually said, if you're not sure, you're not saved. So I went forward and committed my life to Christ. He was sort of Billy Graham figure. But he had another meeting asking people to commit their lives to Christ. And he actually said, that might not be exactly the words, even if the Red Army is marching through the Belfast streets, are you prepared to stand for Christ? Now, and that was the days of the Cold War. That was actually 1955, and I made my commitment. The communist threat was very, very important, even later on, to stand for Christ. So this was reinforcing almost the sort of siege mentality. Now, the little church that I attended, this is a picture of the church in 1960. And that's me on the left-hand side. And the fellow to the right of me is an American preacher who came over and visited us. And he actually said to me, someday you'll come over, I'll see you in America. And I said, it seemed out of my world, I'll never be in America. So I'm here, so he was right. My father's there, my mother's there, and so on. But the little church is the Church of God Reformation movement based in Anderson, Indiana here. So it's, and the lady, I should have a pointer, but just near the front there with the hat, a nice smile, she was an American missionary, Naomi Allen, who was trying to convert the poor Irish. But the important point about this was, and this is where I was brought up in this evangelical world, and I'd forgotten most of the stories about the siege of Derry and all that. I mean, it wasn't very much in my thinking. We had a preacher in 1956 who told us two things. Number one, the Protestant faith is dying out in Ireland. And number two, the IRA had gone communist. Now, that frightened the life out of me, and that's what, I was only a young boy at the time, a teenager, and that was my first interest in politics, because you needed politics to secure your position. Because if Protestantism died out, we associated Protestantism with freedom, with the right to be who you are. I mean, both communities are very much into freedom and rights in a sense, in the centre of the Orange Order. The idea that the IRA has gone communist at that stage is wrong. But, I mean, I was speaking at a meeting very recently, and a fellow called Mick Ryan, who was one of the leading IRA men of the time, he says, we weren't communists, we were still doing our rosaries in those days. That was in 1956 when this preacher said this. But at that time, the leader of the IRA, Cathal Golding, was in prison in England, or had been in prison, and he was reading communist literature, and he was certainly interested in that. And there were people talking about that sort of radical thinking. Now, that's crucial, because everything that happened subsequent to this was interpreted in the light of the communist threat. And the IRA was seen in that. Now, it was exaggerated, but there was a threat for, I mean, I know Roy Johnson was the sort of brains behind. He had been brought into the IRA to do the thinking. The funny thing is, Roy Johnson ended up as a Quaker, and I attended Quaker meetings for many, many years. And it was through the Quakers that I met Roy Johnson. But Roy Johnson was from a Protestant background in Dungannon, but he had attended some communist meetings, so he was labelled a communist. He would say he was a democratic socialist, and he wanted change, and he wanted fairness and all that sort of thing. But he told me in later years that the idea was to take the gun out of politics in Ireland. But we didn't know that. We just saw this as a communist threat. A communist threat meant Moscow. This meant, well, you know all about it. That was the days of the Cold War. It was here, you know, McCarthyism, all that sort of thing. So that was my introduction to politics. Immediately after that photograph, I went to a Bible college in England called All Nations Bible College. It's now called All Nations Christian College. And I spent 2 years there, full-time, lived in, and it opened my mind, coming from the back streets of Belfast. I left school at the age of 14 with no education, really. This is my education. And although it didn't immediately free me from some of the prejudice, it did give me a different worldview, which was important later on. Immediately after I come back, and this is where my real politics began to develop, I came back in 1962, which is the anniversary of the Ulster Covenant. Now, the Ulster Covenant was signed by almost all the Protestant, and so, my understanding is some Catholics as well signed it, to remain British, whatever, you know, that our civil and religious liberty, our economic welfare, and whatever was important, that we remain British. There's a site you can look up and see who signed the covenant, and I looked up, and my relatives, because my family came originally from Monaghan, on the other side of the border, Everybody, men and women, to a man and to a woman, all signed this covenant. Now, I'd know nothing about it until 1962. And at this big demonstration, and typical of Unionists, they wanted to show they were more loyal to Britain than anybody else. So the big flag illustrates that. You can see the size of that flag. There's a man on the left and a man on top. It's about the size of this room, maybe bigger. A massive, massive flag. And at this big demonstration, which was an education for me. So it was bringing me back to why my ancestors had signed the covenant and what they were afraid of and all that sort of thing. And also it told the story of the gun running. So it's helped to legitimise gun running. This was organised by a committee of Unionists and Orange men and so on. Also, 2 years later, I took part in a service, and I think this is quite incredible. Well, you can read it there and see what it is, but it's a service, a religious service in the Free Presbyterian Church. I'd started attending the Free Presbyterian Church around this period. 1964 is the 50th anniversary of 1914, when the guns were brought into Larne and Donaghadee and places like that. And I discovered in more recent times that some of my relatives were actually training the UVF and distributing the guns. So the point with this was in a religious service. As I was growing up in some of those mission halls, they saw politics as, my father told me, politics is a dirty game. You don't want to be involved in politics, it's dirty. And they almost regarded you couldn't be a Christian and be an Orange man, never mind being a Unionist. There was a whole problem with that. But this was bringing the two things together. It was actually a service of thanksgiving for the guns. Now, the way Ian Paisley would have seen it was, of course, that this is a struggle against the people of God. Yeah, you'll not hear much of this, but this is part of the early struggle. And if you don't understand it, you don't understand what happened. As I say, the following year, that's 1964, but 1965, the UVF had been formed, and that was the downward slope into the violence. In that same year, later that same year, there was the first riots in Belfast, which actually served to us to confirm that all the prophecies that we'd heard from the preacher and from Ian Paisley about the trouble that was coming, that we were being sold out and all that sort of thing, was confirmed. Now, it was a crazy thing, because the reason for the riots was because this man, Liam McMillan, or Billy McMillan, as we knew him, was standing for election. Now, Billy McMillan was the leader of the IRA in Belfast, and he had a tricolour in the window. It's important. The problem is I could go on all day trying to explain all the different things, because it's all very complex. The tricolour represents green for the nationalists, orange for the Protestants, and white for peace in between. It's quite a radical message, peace for everybody. But we saw it as, in fact, many Republicans saw it the same, as green, white, and yellow. And I was told what those colours meant was white and yellow were the colours of the Vatican, and green for Ireland. So you can see what it means. And it was also seen as a flag of aggression. The IRA was fighting for this flag, and that was the flag they used. So it was frightening. Ian Paisley threatened to take the flag out of the window of his offices. And because of that, riots blew up, and there was the first riots, water cannons on the street. This was in 1964. I saw the riots because I passed close by and was able to see them. Inside, just quickly, the poem that Billy McMillan has, because the old official IRA was trying to move into a more non-sectarian approach. And he's quoting a poem by a Presbyterian which says, "And let the orange lily be your badge, my patriot brother. It's the everlasting green for me and us for one another." So he was trying to take the true message of the tricolour. 2 years later, a massive big demonstration by nationalists on the Falls Road. I'm very Belfast oriented, of course. But it was led by Betty Sinclair. Betty Sinclair was a well-known communist, a member of the Communist Party. Now, she was a good woman, did a lot of good work. But for us, again, this was Moscow, and this proved that the IRA was communist. And Ian Paisley had this demonstration in opposition. You can see just a rough glance. There was thousands in his parade and thousands upon thousands in the nationalist parade. There was all sorts of rumours about revolution. that the IRA was going to take over the city hall and all sorts of things. They were going to cause a revolution. So this was galvanizing us. This is 66, before the Troubles were said to have started, though the first killings took place in 1966, and which Gusty Spence was imprisoned for. Another thing just happened, which was again helped to reinforce this idea of revolution, was I was in the Shankill Road, and this newspaper blew into a store that I had and landed at my feet. And I looked at it and I saw the name Sean Garland, and I read it, and it was his thinking. Now, in those days, I saw it as the army of the revolution stands idly by. This is revolution. It's the IRA ready to take over. But when you read it, what he was trying to do was lead the IRA in those days away from violence to, and not to stimulate sectarian violence. Anyway, the result of all that was I joined the Young Unionist and the Orange Order. In the middle figure there, if you know Northern Ireland very well, you would recognise it's a young Reg MP. On his right, over this side of the back, is Lord John Laird. Clifford Smith down here on the right, he's an Orange commentator, and I'm over on the left. I became a leading Young Unionist and a leading member of the Orange Order. Well, maybe not a leading member, but it was very prominent. Because of all the background to defend Ulster, there's me protesting against O'Neill, who was seen as he saw the problem. He was trying to open things up, and we were protesting. I told him, I stood about as close as I am to Bonnie here in front of O'Neill one day, and I said, "You're the destroyer of Ulster." And I then became very active and a leading figure in this. And this is me in the middle and the left-hand side here, proposing a resolution that we be masters in our own house and not bring in reforms, because we saw reforms as revolutionary, not reform, if you see what I mean. And we believed that the British government was colluding with the IRA and the Irish sort of thing to try and force us into United Ireland, which United Ireland to us meant domination by the Catholic Church. I mean, in those days, the Irish Constitution laid claim to us. The Catholic Church had a special position in the Constitution, all sorts of complicated things. So we were prepared to resist that. And 2 years later, 1 year later, sorry, I proposed a resolution. This is from some of my documents, which was described as a call to arms. We proposed a resolution that we resist any political solution. Because in our view, and in fact in the view of many of the establishment as well, the IRA had to be defeated, not negotiated with. So we were saying, propose this, but it was seen as a call to arms, and in fact we were organising a paramilitary group. And largely through my own contacts, I knew a leading figure on the UVF, and I told him what we were doing, and he said, "We'll come in with you." And so I was involved, one of the leading figures in this paramilitary group, with the UVF inside it. So in a sense, the critics of us were right. We were promoting resistance, armed resistance. But in the middle of this, it was a crucial, this is crucially important. The UVF, as Matt said, I mean, one of the leading figures in the UVF was, his boss was a very good friend of mine. He was, I think, the intelligence officer of the UVF. And Billy Mitchell was very close to me, always talked about Billy Mitchell. But in the middle of all this, for a whole lot of reasons, I had come to the conclusion that some of the unionists that I was with, now this doesn't apply to everybody, but some of the unionists, the more extreme element who actually helped to cause the trouble, believed in a Protestant ascendancy. And I heard them talking about this, and I was aghast, because to me, I believed in a democracy. I believe in everybody having the right to do what they are, but they believed in an ascendancy. That set alarm bells in my head. Second thing was to refer to Loyalists as cannon fodder. They were going to direct operations, and that, because I was from a Loyalist background, I rejected that. I was launched in a whole process of rethinking everything, and it took my life in my hands. But I ended up going to, for example, Queen's University. I started studying, was leading up to university, and met John Morrow there, who was a leader of Corrymeela, and it was a great release to begin to think about things in a wider context. I mean, I took serious risks, and I was told to keep my head down, keep out of things, which I did. In 1979, I committed myself publicly to peace. I was introduced by this friend of mine, who was an intelligence officer in the UVF, to Gusty Spence when he came out of jail. And we worked very closely together, coming right up to the Good Friday Agreement. I know my time's gone out, so I'm rushing through this. So, sort of things that we ended up involved in. This was a meeting in Rostrevor in County Down. On the left, there's two Bosnian refugees, the wounded refugees from Bosnia. It's myself in the middle, and then a leading member of Sinn Féin, Francie Malloy, the present President of Ireland on his right, our right, and then Tommy Sands, who's a singer, and Peter Emerson, who's done an awful lot of peace work. Got involved in all this sort of work, went to the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, as I think Bunny said, and was disciplined for the Unionist Party for going because they saw it as Gerry Adams' forum. This is a Roman Catholic sister with me at an orange tattoo in Belfast, along with two IRA people, a husband and wife who were both IRA. But out of that, her brother, Jim Lynch, who'd been in the IRA, he died. And believe it or not, Gusty Spence and I went to the funeral. And believe it or not, that's Gusty Spence giving an oration at the funeral of an IRA man. I found that quite incredible. I was with him, I went to the Catholic Church, stood at beside the grave, and I think it was a brother of the man who died. He said to Gusty, would you say a few words? So this is Gusty speaking. Actually, only Gusty could have got away with that because he was highly respected. Just quickly, in 1995, I was asked to share a platform with Martin McGuinness. Actually, it was Martin McGuinness, Mark Durkin, Albert Reynolds, and Ken Newell. And the point about it was Loyalists supported me in doing all those things. Loyalists have not got the credit for the positive things they did. They were in the middle of this conflict. They were shooting, they were killing, they were dying. I got a message before I went on to this, when I was doing a TV interview, saying two things. A message from David Irvine, the leader of the PUP, which is linked to the UVF, and the leader of the UVF, congratulating me and supporting me in doing this, whereas Unionists were opposing everything I did. There's another picture. I was disciplined for this as well. I went to an opening of the Sinn Féin office, and so they disciplined me for talking to Gerry Adams. And I said, look, I was only at this office. I didn't know Gerry Adams was going to be there. And they said, but look, you're smiling.
Not actually looking at him, right?
This is Billy Mitchell, the fellow that Matt mentioned, on the right, Gerry Adams on the left. And Billy did a powerful amount of work. This is in the New Lloyd's Road Festival. One of the things he said to Gerry Adams, sure, you must be an Ulster Scot with a name like Adams. And he stood up and he says, no, I'm Irish, Scots-Irish, I'm Scots-Irish, not Ulster Scots. Same thing. I'm right at the end of this. On the Good Friday Agreement, I've been through all this, and through the help of Gary McMichael over here, I was to go up to the Stormont estate, and the Ian Paisley supporters had blocked all the entrances. But I heard there was one way in, so I was walking up towards this, crowds and crowds of people, and I saw Gary McMichael, who was a negotiator, so he had the right to be in there. And I called him, and he brought me to the car, brought me into the grounds. I get into the grounds, and who comes out at the front door? Billy Mitchell and Anne Carr of the Women's Coalition. They called me over, and I got into the building where the Good Friday Agreement was reached. I was the only non-negotiator, and I was free to wander around. But just an illustration, I was in the Sinn Féin room. They weren't looking too happy. Things weren't going well. I was in the Alliance room, the Women's Coalition, the Loyalists, and I decided, I'm going to the Unionist room. I'm a Unionist. And I sat down there, and the negotiations were going on, and John Taylor was in giving a report. And somebody pointed at me and said, what's he doing here? So I beat a hasty retreat. Now, I left. It wasn't thrown out, but it was virtually thrown out. But it was a wonderful experience just to be there and mix with everybody through that. I have to tell you this story. I know time's almost gone. In the course of writing, I think it was when I wrote the book about Gusty Spence, I'm not just sure now, I got an interview with Martin Meehan. Now, Martin Meehan was a top Republican, a hard man, hard man. And I was talking to him, and he told me that his grandfather died in the First World War in France. And I told Gusty Spence that Martin had said this. They knew each other. And Gusty Spence, the next time I saw Gusty Spence, he had all these papers, the grave, the name, because Martin had got his grandfather's name wrong. He called him Cornelius. It was Camillus. But I presented this to Martin Maine. And this is Martin Maine in France pointing to his grandfather's name on the memorial in France, which was a wonderful experience. And for him, it was a very moving thing. Again, it's the politics, the personal thing between he and I and Gusty Spence that changed things. And the last thing that Martin did, he died quite recently. He said to me, could we get Gusty to go with him to do a television program in France together? But Gusty, he's older than Martin was even, and he's not that well. He didn't do it, which was rather sad. Just a slightly hesitant note, because just to illustrate, there is a cause for this. The poster on the left was at the end of my street. That was about 1996. Roy Garland is a traitor to the people of Drumbeg and Ulster. Now, that's one of my prized possessions now, but at the time, I mean, it really was, there was threats from unionists who saw this as we were making peace with Republicans who were terrorists, who were the enemy, and we were selling out. And the right-hand side is representing the year, you would know all about this from Derry, the burning of Lundy, who was seen as a traitor in the siege of Derry. So what they were saying to me was, you have to watch yourself. And it was serious. My name and Gusty Spence's and others appeared in the leaflet of the Loyalist Volunteer Force, which was a breakaway, a right-wing breakaway from the UVF. Sorry, I've rushed through the last step, but I've tried to sort of touch on things, maybe we'll touch on later, how individuals are very, very important, and the relationships that are established to bring about change. And it has been actually, for me, a wonderful experience to get to know Republicans, because one of the first things I discovered was they're just like us. They live almost side by side.
Don't stretch it too far, Roy, okay?
But I mean, it's the same background. I worked in the Royal Victoria Hospital in the Falls Road when I was a student. I went to university late, and I worked with them, and they were just like us. And they're the same sort of lifestyle. Well, mostly was revolved around the pub and the boogies. But it was very important to discover that, and to find that everybody's, we all have our stories. And if we work together and respect each other, there's a future. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll take 15 minutes for questions, and I think Roy reminded me at the end that one of the reasons that I'm happy that these three men are all together is because they are quite free. I think Roy illustrates that perhaps most starkly of party political agendas or any sort of constraint that they might be under if they belonged to a more active group that whose purview they were under. So it's nice that they can have this open conversation, and actually I think quite not necessarily typical. So I'd like to open it up to the floor, and anybody who has a question for any of the speakers.
And Bonnie, will you have them wait for the microphone to come since it's being
Yes. Is somebody carrying a mic? Oh, okay. Okay. So,
Questions for Matt. Matt, you were talking, I think you said your father was rejected from some jobs, and they put RC on, Roman Catholic, and you said you were marginalized as a Catholic and repressed. Could you go into some detail and describe your marginalization and being repressed within that society?
Well, I told you earlier on that we lived in an extended family situation. So actually, I grew up in a household where there was 4 adults, and only one person in the household actually had a vote in the elections at that particular point in time. And in stark contrast, and this was part of a gerrymander, and actually Derry, where Kevin and I come from, is actually the grossest example of political gerrymandering probably in the face of the earth. But the reality is that as part of that gerrymander, a unionist property owner could have as many as 40 votes. So even though within the confines of Derry City, the unionist population was in a minority, they actually controlled the city council. Now, here in the United States, it really doesn't matter that, well, we might debate this point. I don't think it's horrendous either way, whether it's the Republican Party or the Democratic Party control a city council, because the politics is not exclusionary. But for us, what it meant is that we didn't get jobs in our own city. And it meant that my parent, my father, was, and the nearest analogy you can think of is the Mexican migrant laborers that come across the border to work in the agricultural industry for a pittance. Well, my father had to go to England, Scotland, Wales, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, and he was gone a lot when we were growing up. So really and truly, there's many things I could say, but I think the greatest thing I could say on a personal note is discrimination robbed us of our father's presence for a good portion of our growing up.
Could I just say a wee bit that the same rules apply to the unionist community as to the nationalist community? My father had actually 3 votes, believe it or not.
Right.
But it was because he had 2 wee shops. There are hucksters of wee shops
Right.
in the Old Lodge Road in Belfast. My mother had no vote. And we no, you know, it was the householder. Sorry, he had a vote for the house and he had a vote for the 2 properties. Everybody was the same. If he had a property, I knew a Catholic who had 13 votes because he had businesses. So it applied right across the board, and it applied in England, but only up to 1945 or something,
Right.
and it was abolished. I mean, it was wrong, but you know what I mean? It did apply across the board.
Well, can I just on that point respond that you're telling the truth. You're absolutely correct. However, really a decision was made to disenfranchise, because there were Protestants who were disenfranchised,
Yeah.
but the Protestants were disenfranchised for the greater good of a repressive unionist statelet. So they were sacrificial lambs to make sure that the greater the greater element was protected, i.e. that the state would continue about the business of repression.
The gentleman with the tie.
Gentlemen, you all brought us up to your point to where the Good Friday Agreement was reached. And obviously, that was a great moment. But as today, more than 10 years later, we don't have a Bill of Rights. There's cogs in it, such as the United Ireland, and it appears to an outsider that things have stalled. And obviously, Roy and Kevin still in the North Ireland, and Matt, with your ties there, can you guys each touch briefly on the progress with the Good Friday Agreement since the signing, specifically with the Bill of Rights and United Ireland?
Yeah, can I just take that very quickly? That's one of the points I tried to make in my contribution, because I think you're right. I think you're right that the situation to a certain extent has stalled. Now, it's certainly better than what it was, and nobody wants ever to go back to what it was. And I don't think there's any great belief that we ever will go back to where we were. But you're dead right. The situation has stalled. It may well be that the Good Friday Agreement, as it was negotiated and agreed in 1998, is maybe now starting to reach the end of its natural life. And maybe it's time now to look to the next stage and see how we can bring it on from the Good Friday Agreement. So I think that's a very valid point.
I think you're right. I mean, clearly, even a superficial examination of the Good Friday Accord realizes it's just one point on the continuum. And actually, it kind of points up something that I said in the course of my presentation. It's about stasis is our worst enemy. Stasis is our worst enemy, and really, it's going to require a great deal of energy to make things roll forward. And rather interestingly, one of the things that I didn't address was the American support base for the Republican movement here. And the American support base actually is demonstrative of a form of stasis, because what they did was they were told that the peace process had begun, the war was over, and everything was going to be hunky-dory, and we're going to all ride off into the sunset together. And of course, that's not reflective of reality at all. But what it has meant is that, to a large measure, the Irish support base has now closed its eyes and is not looking in the direction of the North to promote change. Now, maybe, just maybe, because of a homegrown issue over, the situation of Irish Republican prisoners, eyes are starting to open again. But the reality is, it's only a point. The Good Friday Accord's only a point in a continuum, right?
Yeah, well, I would say it's a very dramatic point, very important point.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, the old Orange State, if you want to call it that way, is gone. And the future's in our hands. It's up. In fact, the British government said, if you want a united Ireland, you've got to, if you agree to it, if that's what you want, and the Irish government will facilitate it. That's what the Irish government, I think the Irish government's a bit reluctant about that.
Right.
But it's a very important progress, and I don't think we should minimise it. And I think I would be optimistic about the future, but there's going to be difficult decisions. The system, this mandatory coalition, it's like two parties sort of controlling the whole system and working it to their own benefit, which is a bit like replacing one party control to two-party control. So there's a whole lot of things have to change, but we're on the road, and politics is messy. As you know, all politics is messy. And I think we've made amazing progress. I also think, I've thought from a long time, as Matt was talking about the personal thing is so important. You may not be able to change the world, but you can change your own relationships. And you start to get to understand and respect other people's views. That's freedom, to my mind.
Gentlemen, you make us all proud of our Irish heritage. I'm curious as to just how extensive and real is the threat today of real and continuity IRA, and then secondly, with the return of policing and justice to the island, how do you foresee the evolution of the court system, and where do you anticipate we go from there?
Do you mind if I come in on that first? Part of the problem is, let me address the court system first. Part of the problem is that there's still emergency legislation on the books, okay, Prevention of Terrorism Act specifically. And I have a major problem with that, because the bottom line is, when you retain emergency legislation on the books, it actually acts as a Damoclean sword. It's always hanging over your head, and you don't know when it's going to be reinstituted, reused. It's like the old Special Powers Act. So I have a problem with that. I think that type of legislation is going to have to be addressed. And actually, frankly, that's also going to have to be addressed in the south of Ireland as well, because what gets lost in the shuffle is that a lot of and I call it repressive legislation, and the Special Powers Act, the Emergency Provisions Act, and then most lately the Prevention of Terrorism Act, they were mirrored along the way in the Offences Against the State Act in the south of Ireland. So there's business to be done in the south of Ireland, and actually one of the things that I lament, frankly, is that there's not some sort of a representative from the southern political establishment participating in this dialogue here today, because again, I keep coming back to that's a story that is not being told.
Just on the dissonance, the CIRA and the RIRA and some Oglan and Heron and so on. I was engaged in for a number of over a year or two, about 10 years ago, with the sovereignty movement, which is sort of linked with the real IRA, and it seemed to me that what their alternative is to go back to squabbling over United Ireland or not United Ireland. They want Irish independence, United Ireland, and they're not prepared to have any sort of negotiation over that. To my mind, the way forward has to be agreement, and agreed Ireland, and working together. Otherwise, you go back, and we haven't seen anything yet. If we were to go in their direction, it's a recipe for war. They're not very large. They don't have many policies. They're not prepared even to engage. Recently, I tried to reinstitute some sort of negotiations, or not negotiations, but dialogue with them. They won't talk. They say, yes, we'll always talk, but they don't do it. And so they've isolated themselves to a large extent. They're bitter opponents of Sinn Féin. In fact, one of their gripes was that Sinn Féin wasn't taking them seriously. That's what they told us. And they actually wanted new mediators between themselves and Sinn Féin, but Sinn Féin said no. But you can understand why, because there's just no give. It's just sort of black and white to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the problem with the dissidents, that by and large, the dissidents really go on the basis that they know what they're against. But the only thing that they can say they're for is some kind of an ideal. But they don't really have any way of actually translating that into any kind of reality. You ask about their threat, and I think that there is a threat. I can't see that it would ever develop into the kind of threat that the provisional movement posed down through its existence, because largely they're localised. In fact, the only place they're really active at the moment is probably Derry City. They certainly have the capacity to cause upset if they get, to use the word facetiously, lucky. They could certainly cause large-scale injury and death. But the reality is that they don't really have any proper support at the moment. There's a certain degree of sympathy that attaches to them from certain quarters, because there is a certain degree of disillusionment with politics and politicians generally. And I keep coming back to my point about the benefit for the ordinary people. That a lot of people's lives in the last 12 years haven't really changed, and in some ways with the economic downturn, a lot of people's lives are now worse off. But those people are now looking at major Sinn Féin, major IRA leaders like Martin McGuinness, people like Jerry Kelly, and now you look at them, see them very well dressed, not losing any weight anymore, and sitting in well-paid jobs with guaranteed pensions. And there's a certain disconnect there, that these guys have done all right, but they've kind of left us behind. And the dissidents are tapping into that. But I don't see them ever becoming a widespread movement again, unless somebody somewhere commits some kind of a major atrocity to bring public support behind them. You mentioned the court system, and I'm not a criminal lawyer. My main area is in property and commercial and that. There is emergency legislation still on the books. I don't think anybody really suggests that it's a major source of oppression anymore. The court system and certainly the judiciary has changed in personnel. Whether you consider that they've changed in outlook anymore is another matter, because there's no doubt about it that there are a significant number of Catholic judges, which wouldn't have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. And in fact, the present Lord Chief Justice is a Catholic. In fact, it's the second Catholic in a row to hold the post of Lord Chief Justice. And coincidentally, he's also an ex-pupil of St. Colum's College, where we came from.
Hooray for St. Colum's. Hey, the point I was going to make about the dissidents is that I think they've got the capacity to, in broad terms, to fray the edge of the peace process fabric. I think that's ultimately what their capacity is. I don't think it's going to go beyond that. However, something that Kevin said actually does make an interesting point, and it raises the question, maybe Sinn Féin should be more sensitive to that idea, should be more sensitive to responding to the criticism that they're leaving their own people behind.
Yeah. I don't think they even realise that they're doing it. There's nothing conscious
Right,
about what
right.
the Sinn Féin leadership's doing. I know a lot of them, and they're very, very committed and very dedicated people. And I think they probably would be horrified in some ways if
Right.
they really realised that people were now beginning to think of them like that. So, as you say, it's maybe just an unconscious lack of sensitivity.
Kevin, it's one of the, and it actually goes to the heart of one of the points that you made to me in conversation, that somehow or other Sinn Féin has been about the business of taking over the role of the SDLP, more SDLP than the SDLP themselves. Now, I know policy-wise, politically, that's clearly not the case, but for disaffected young people in particular, that's perhaps the way that they might be seeing it. And it's not, I'm not about the business of telling Sinn Féin what they do. I'm here in the United States. That's not what I'm about. But it does raise the question, maybe they should be more sensitive to perception.
It should be said that loyalist working class people feel exactly the same.
Yeah.
It hasn't, in fact, some of them anyway, that it hasn't trickled down to them, and they feel
Right.
what's so great about the Good Friday Agreement? It benefits the politicians.
That's right. No, there's no doubt. It's the same on both sides. Yeah, that's something that it has actually managed to unite us on.
I hate to cut this off because it is absolutely fascinating, but we are 15 minutes over the time that we thought. So what we'll do is we'll take a break from now till 11. Please be here right at 11. We'll start our next panel then. And before you go, please join me once again in thanking our panelists.